Every year, millions of people flock to the North Italian town of Florence. They come to see the great artworks of the Renaissance, to admire their enormous beauty. The city's religious paintings and sculptures form one of the great achievements of Christianity. But it's not always appreciated that when they were made, they reflected a fundamental change in the way men saw God and their relationship with him. That change caused a fierce controversy which cost many lives, nearly brought down a government, and took the art of the Renaissance to the brink of destruction. At the beginning of the 15th century, Florence was a free republic that had become the richest city-state in Italy by specializing in commerce and particularly in banking. The richest and most powerful man in Florence was Cosimo de' Medici. He was banker not only to the leading merchants of Europe, but to the Pope himself. Cosimo knew that the Old Testament prophets condemn usury, the lending of money at interest, and that Jesus drove the moneylenders out of the temple. This worried him, and he turned to his friend the Pope for advice.
Cosimo was talking to the Pope, when the Pope Eugenius IV, when he was in Florence, and he said he had certain things on his conscience which worried him. And so Eugenius says, well, spend 40,000 florins on the convent of San Marco, and that will, you know, solve your problems on your conscience. So we do know that to some extent the founding of the monastery was, I mean, it was to do with the problem of usury which all merchants face.
As part of the lavish refurbishment, Cosimo employed a Dominican monk to paint frescoes throughout the monastery. The monk was Fra Angelico. Nowadays, he's considered to be one of the greatest masters of Renaissance painting. But these frescoes were principally designed as aids to religious contemplation.
In the small rooms of the individual friars, what are properly called cells, the images are meant to be moments of deep interior reflection, moments in which the friar enters ever more profoundly into one or another of the mysteries of the life of Christ or of the Virgin. To live with one of those frescoes, not as we see it, briefly en passant, but to live with one of those frescoes year in and year out for as many as 5 or 6 years is literally to have one's life transformed by a spiritual image which at the same time is ravishingly beautiful, that invites and practically obliges you to transform your own life.
The people who are shown in Fra Angelico's paintings are different from those that would have appeared in religious images of earlier centuries. Faces are portrayed with an emphasis on characterization. And bodies are represented with a new care for anatomical detail. Until now, Christianity had seen man as being created in the image of God. Now God was being depicted in the image of man. In a new development that became known as humanism.
The important thing about humanism is it does stress the importance of man. I mean, the saying of the ancient Greek Protagoras, that man is the measure of all things, in a sense, for me, typifies what humanism is about.
God the Father therefore took man, and assigning him a place in the middle of the world, addressed him thus: "You who are confined by no limits shall determine for yourself your own nature in accordance with your own free will. I have set you at the center of the world, so that from there you may more easily survey whatever is in the world."
The new interest in man at the center of the universe stemmed partly from a rediscovery of the pagan culture of the classical world. Excavations of ancient sites had uncovered statues which celebrated the glory of the human form. And life drawing analyzed the exact composition of the body. The early 15th century saw the anatomical knowledge the sculptural figures of classical antiquity as the best that the human spirit had been able to create in those particular areas of knowledge.
Just as the scriptures passed on to us by the Jews, what Christians call the Old Testament, are seen as necessary preparation for Christ, the 14th and 15th century saw all of classical culture as recuperable in this light. It was part of a preparation for Christ. It needed to be interpreted properly, parts of it needed to be expurgated, but the pagans were themselves already somehow within the church.
In 1428, Masaccio painted an altarpiece which used the newly discovered details of classical architecture and the newly devised skills of perspective drawing to create a realistic space in which to portray the Holy Trinity. The likenesses of the patron and his wife are shown kneeling at the foot of the painting. The relationship between man and God had never previously been shown in such a lifelike way.
The most impenetrable mystery that Christians find in God himself, the mystery of a God who is one and three, one God, three persons, is presented in absolutely accessible terms, as if one could put one's hand through the wall and touch these figures, as if one could measure the depth of space in which they dwell.
The Florentines were immensely proud of their city. They'd already had a fine cathedral, but the planned dome had never been built. They appointed the foremost architect of the day, Filippo Brunelleschi, to create the largest dome in Christendom. He embarked on the task not knowing exactly how he would achieve it, but confident that since the project was dedicated to God and Mary, the Mother of Christ, that he would somehow find a way.
He had to invent a variety of things and procedures such as today any builder would find daunting. At one point, simply to get his workmen up and down rapidly, he had to obviate the problem of having them descend for lunch. And so he has a kitchen created on the scaffolding itself. Vasari says that there they cooked and drank great quantities of wine. One hopes they didn't, because it was very high.
The Florentines believed that God, in creating man in his own image, made men and women intelligent. When men and women use that intelligence to grasp the underlying laws of nature and create marvels of engineering, then they are at their most godlike.
The Florentine Cathedral was built by the city. Income from various taxes, and everybody who made a will in Florence had to make a small donation to the construction of the cathedral, so that it was very implicated in the city's vision of itself and view of itself.
Because it was a civic as well as a religious building, many of the images in the Duomo in Florence seem to have no religious connections. Some represent soldiers who'd fought for the Florentine Republic, such as Uccello's fresco of the English mercenary general Sir John Hawkwood. To us, the statues and paintings are works of art, but to the Florentines there were practical ways of ensuring the safety of their immortal souls.
If you were very great and grand, you could spend sums that showed your greatness and grandeur by donating a chapel, an altarpiece, or even an entire church. If you were on the other end of the scale, you did as much as you could by donating a smaller sum to put a candle in front of an altar, or perhaps a modest painting on a hospital bed.
One rich patron, Giovanni Rucellai, paid for a new facade for the church of Santa Maria Novella.
I have spent a great deal of money on the facade of the church, which cost me more than 1,000 ducats. These things have given me the greatest satisfaction and pleasure, because in part they serve the honor of God, as well as the honor of the city and the commemoration of myself.
For the Florentines, religion was almost an exchange relationship with God. that they gave to God, and then God gave back to them. So Rucellai is saying he's done it for the love of the city, so that part of his patronage is to beautify the city, but it's also giving to God.
As the century went on, the celebration of the power and wealth of the patron became more and more important. The original pious intention was increasingly cloaked in pride. Patrons often required that their own likenesses appeared in the works they were paying for.
In the Adoration of the Magi by Botticelli, for example, the eldest king is actually a portrait of the uncrowned king of Florence, Cosimo the Elder de' Medici. This celebrates his greatness. It also underlines the fact that just as in the New Testament the kings brought their wealth to lay it at the feet of Christ, so in modern times Cosimo de' Medici had made his wealth available to, for example, the observant Dominicans of San Marco.
The great families of Florence built palaces for themselves, austere and imposing on the outside, richly decorated inside. Cosimo de' Medici's palace had its own private chapel, covered with frescoes by Benozzo Gozzoli.
It is a private chapel, and in this private chapel, the Medici could show themselves to themselves and selected visitors in a way that they probably would not have allowed in a more public sphere. And that is, they could be shown in a retinue of kings and be shown to be imitating kings. So while they're not depicted as kings, they did not dare to do that, the Medici are shown following the kings in this procession, so that they both gave a splendid donation, in a sense, to God by having a chapel. They had a place in which they could celebrate Mass, which was quite unusual to be able to do. So sort of they had extra, they were demonstrating extra piety by this, but they demonstrated it in fancy dress in a way that would please, as say, themselves and others who were allowed in to this inner sanctum. It was a private space.
The patron's love of luxury and desire for self-glorification inspired hatred in some quarters. In the 1480s, a reforming preacher named Girolamo Savonarola arrived in Florence and became the prior of San Marco, the very monastery which Cosimo de' Medici had so sumptuously restored. Savonarola was a fiery preacher, and he condemned from the pulpit of the Duomo the conspicuous display of wealth in a religious context.
There thou seest the great prelates with splendid mitres of gold and precious stones on their heads, and silver croziers in hand. There they stand at the altar, decked with fine copes and styles of brocade. In the primitive church, the chalices were wood, the prelates of gold. In these days, the church hath chalices of gold and prelates of wood.
And he denounced the art. I mean, he pointed out how impious it was to paint as Mary Magdalene or Mary, the Virgin Mary, people that everyone could recognize. And he sort of comments that people looked at paintings and said, there's Mary from down the street. And of course he thought that was scandalous.
You fill your churches with your own vanities. Do you imagine that the Virgin Mary went about dressed as she is depicted? I tell you, she went about dressed as a poor person, simply, and so veiled that her face could hardly be seen. You would do well to blot out pictures so unsuitably painted. You make the Virgin Mary look like a harlot.
When he says that, he's certainly referring to the exceedingly worldly way in which Botticelli, in the first part of his career, often working for the Medici, depicted the Virgin Mary as an aristocratic lady with a beautiful child surrounded by elegant page boys who no longer even sport wings. We can't even claim that they're angels. They're simply elegant aristocratic youths who hold her book or smile lovingly at her and at each other. Savonarola had an extraordinary influence on people. the wigs, the jewels, the fripperies that were common in aristocratic Florentine life became unfashionable suddenly, and a group of vigorous, pious, but also rather robust-looking young men might stop you on the street and say, you don't really want that necklace, you don't really want that fine hat and plume, you don't really want those jewels or that richly coiled wig on your head, do you? And you were probably morally obliged, socially obliged at that point to divest yourself of these things.
As part of his attack on wealth and finery, Savonarola had a 60-foot bonfire built in the Piazza della Signoria in the center of Florence during the Carnival of 1497. He encouraged Florentines to throw onto it objects considered to be vain and luxurious. It's said that Botticelli voluntarily threw onto it some of his early paintings. The event has become known as the Bonfire of the Vanities.
There was made on the Piazza della Signoria a pile of vain things, nude statues and playing boards, heretical books, and many other vain things of great value, estimated at thousands of florins. Although some lukewarm people gave trouble, throwing dead cats and other dirt upon it, the boys nevertheless set it on fire and burnt everything.
Savonarola was a political force in Florence and in Italy. This threatened certain people in Florence who wanted power, and it threatened the papacy.
The Medici family had to flee into exile. Savonarola became the virtual ruler of a fundamentalist republic. But he'd made too many enemies. He was excommunicated. When he continued to preach against the Pope's instructions, he was arrested and imprisoned in a tower of the Palazzo della Signoria. Eventually, he was sentenced to death with 2 of his followers. His body was to be burned in the very same square where he himself had held his Bonfire of the Vanities.
In a few hours, they were burnt, their legs and arms gradually dropping off, part of their bodies remaining hanging to the chains. A quantity of stones were thrown to make them fall, as there was a fear of the people getting hold of them. And then the hangman hacked down the post and burnt it on the ground, bringing lots of brushwood and stirring the fire up over the dead bodies so that the very smallest piece was consumed. Then they fetched carts and carried the last bit of dust to the Arno by the Ponte Vecchio, in order that no remains should be found.
Although Savonarola had been discredited, the concern he felt about the opulence of the church did not go away. But for the next 200 years, the church would continue to grow in wealth and display and to be the greatest patron of the art of the Renaissance.